Greetings, neighbors. This is Reflections, a show sponsored by the Paducah Cooperative Ministry where we, all of us together, do God's work with human hands. My name is Gregory Waldrop, and I'm the pastor at Fountain Avenue United Methodist Church, and I'm one of your co-hosts. I'm joined by Karen Winkel from the United Church of Paducah. Welcome, Karen.
Good to see you, Gregory. Good to have you with us. We're excited today to enter into a Psalm study. We're looking at Psalm 77, and we're doing that with two wonderful men and pastors, and together we'll just I don't want to say tear it up, but we'll experience the fire of the Spirit. How's that? But we're joined by Reverend Dr. Rick Dye, who's the district superintendent for the Paducah district of the United Methodist Church, and Reverend Phil Justice, who serves as associate pastor at First Christian Church here in Paducah. Good to have both of you with us. I just would invite each of you to say a word. Rick?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here and to share with you in this experience.
And it's a delight to be here, and it's an honor. It's always good to look at God's Word and see what He has to say to us.
Wonderful. Well, what I'll do is read the scripture. The words are on your screen. This is Psalm 77, and we've selected our psalms just really with connecting with a book by Eugene Peterson, Where Your Treasure Is. So he is lifting up some psalms that probably most of us are not as familiar with as some of the old favorites, but they're ones that kind of invite us to go from ourselves to kind of a new way of being in the world and being in relationship with God. So this is Psalm 77. I cry aloud to God that He may hear me. In the day of my trouble I seek the Lord. In the night my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. I think of God and I moan. I meditate and my spirit faints. You keep my eyelids from closing. I'm so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old and remember the years of long ago. I commune with my heart in the night. I meditate and search my spirit. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has His steadfast love ceased forever? Are His promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has He in anger shut up His compassion? And I say, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. I will call to mind the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your works of old. I will meditate on all your work and muse on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is so great as our God? You are the God who works wonders. You've displayed your might among the peoples. With your strong arm you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. The very deep trembled. The clouds poured out water, the skies thundered, your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the mighty waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. This is the word of God for us. The people of God made it come to life in us.
Thanks be to God. Well,
a little drama there.
A little drama going on. What do we hear in that? What things do you hear?
To me, this is a time when I think all people of God understand that there are times that you not only hit a wall, the wall falls on top of you. And the first several verses reflect that in the person's life. And what do we do with that?
When I read this, I get a sort of a capsule picture of the book of Job, because it talks about this lament of asking, where is God? Where have you gone to? Why am I going through all this suffering? Why am I dealing with all of this? Why have you forsaken me? And then some things that the psalmist says that they will do, and finally a remembrance, much the way Job had a remembrance of who God was. And so in my reading of that, that came to mind, that in some ways you have just a small version of the whole book of Job in this one psalm, as it tries to portray and ask that question, when the brick wall does fall on you, what is our normal attitude? And many times it is to question God. It is to say, where have you been? Where did you go? Why are you doing this to me? Of course, we never say that when we're prospering. We have a temptation of just saying that when the troubles come, and that may be part of our difficulty.
I was reading in a study last night, 116, which mirrors this in some ways, the same kind of lament, the same kind of wonder. And I began to sort of imagine or think, in our world, we are in control of, or we think we're in control. We have some semblance of control over so much of our world. We have sort of climate controls in our houses and in our cars. We have some semblance of order in the world in terms of justice and institutions that hold things together. But I can imagine back when these were written, they had this sense, and which is true really for us as well. They were in the middle of these vast, enormous movements and actions and these sweeps across history, whether it's weather or whether it's political or whether it's sickness in their own lives, that they were completely out of control of, and they just had this sense that there was so few places to go, so few sanctuaries to give them a sense of control. And I hear those little impressions of that. It's such great act of faith, really. That whole, I will call to mind your deeds. I'll remember your wonders. I'll meditate on your works. It is really a great act of faith. This last ice storm that we went through, I think, we had a sense of what it felt like to understand we were out of control of things, really and truly, and how in the middle of all the crossroads and sections of weather and physical activities and neighbors and all those things just made us understand, I think, what they felt recurrently, and those little glimmers of hope that show up feel like really big witnesses to me. Big gift.
I kind of get the sense in this, though, that part of the struggle for this person is something that they've, it isn't that the wall fell on them. It's almost like they kind of pulled on something that drew that wall on them. That sometimes, the agony that we experience is agony that we create. That what happened for Job was something that occurred in his life, but I think a good portion of human suffering is at least embroidered on by us, and it really does have to do with what we're paying attention to and what we're able to pay attention to. I'm thinking, as you were speaking, Gregory, I was thinking a little bit about a time when I had gone from pastoral heaven to what seemed to be the desert. I'd made a move, and it was my own choice. I was still a student, but I went to the new setting, and it's like, well, there's nothing here. It's just awful, and and it was kind of like going from paradise to non-paradise. There was nothing wrong with it. It was just that what I'd had was so marvelous, and I just kept pointing out to myself all the things that were, not good, and why would God want me to do this if this and this and this were, wasn't good. And I happened upon a book by a fellow who talked about that at the heart of prayer is gratitude. And I thought, well, there's nothing to be grateful for here. And every night I had this funny little chair, and I called it my prayer chair, but it's like I have to find something every day to be grateful for. And I would just kind of comb through the day and just pause at any little thing that I could be grateful for. And by the end of the summer, just with that nightly practice, there was an amazing array of things for which I was grateful. I felt like I was, again in paradise, but nothing had changed. that community was still the way that it was, and those people were still the way that they were. And I realized that, what I was suffering was, of my own making.
I think that's very true, because in the first part of this, it was a spiritual pity party. And we've all been there. We've all done that. And we'll continue to do that. But studying this the other night, I noticed that in the first 10 verses, the writer mentioned God 7 times and himself 20 times. From verses 11 on, he mentioned God 20 times and himself 3 times. Huge difference. Just like you decided, I'm going to call on God, I'm going to find something to be thankful for, I'm going to make a change. And you did it. You didn't know how, but you did it. And God, I think, respects that. It's kind of like faith honors God and God honors faith.
Yeah.
You did a good job.
I think that's so important a notion too. We tend to make our faith so cerebral. We are tempted to disembody faith. We make it some sort of feeling or mind exercise. And this idea that somehow our changed behaviors welcome Jesus into our lives more. That in fact, it's as we live faithfully what God's given us to live, that we in fact discover the power to live that life and the power to be what it is God has made it. We keep wanting to say, well, I'm sorry for that, God, and then we keep going with those same activities, and we wonder where the power is, and it is that in those living out those new behaviors that we discover the Spirit and the power to live this new life that God gives us.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
A preacher told me one time that we never fail any of God's tests. We just keep taking them over and over again until we get it right. That really has a lot of truth in it.
I like the verse 9 where it says, has God forgotten to be gracious? And that, that's something of an accusation. And sometimes I think we feel like that we can't bring our questions or our doubts or our fears or our loneliness to God, that we've always got to be up not only for ourselves and everyone else, we've got to be up for God because God expects that of us. But I think God, being a gracious God, understands that as we go through life, there are going to be times where we do doubt and where we do question what goes on. I've heard, as I think we all have, God given credit for some things that I just really don't think God had anything to do with at all, because I don't see how God can save one and punish the other in the same event. I don't think God cherry picks as to who's righteous and I'm going to bless you, but I'm going to make you suffer. And so I think those are honest doubts that people bring to God, and that we need to celebrate that we serve a God that allows that to happen. Because many times the other gods don't. The other powers would not be as lenient.
Right.
And as you say that, I'm thinking about, when we receive people into our homes, the room that we let them enter says everything about how we are relating to them and how intimate or not. And, the asking of these earnest questions and the invitation God gives us really to ask them, makes me think of, late night conversations, in the kitchen or, in the place where you really hang out, as opposed to, kind of the polite conversation that we have in the parlor or the formal living room, and that, how painful that must be to God to only be allowed in just that little bit where we really don't have honest engagement, where we don't discover how ready God is to hear whatever's on our minds or to wrestle with us with whatever concern we bring.
We talk about Job, and you've mentioned his liking this to Job's words. Talk about Job and this writer's patience, but really what they offer to us is a encouragement to, express our anger, is to shake a fist at God, which Job did, which is part of what's happening here. I can remember working as a hospital chaplain, and a woman spent a long time telling me just how unfair life was, and it was. Her life and the sickness she had to undertake and had been terrible, and the house and her life and her household, the whole bit. And after she'd gone on long about it, I said, have you ever prayed that to Jesus, to God is what I said, to God? And she looked at me and says, oh no, said, I could never tell my sweet Jesus that. And in some ways, this psalm is saying God can handle it. And if God can handle the death of his own son, he can certainly handle the pangs of frustration and hurt and anger that we feel as well. And I think this is a enormous green light to our offering to God, speaking to God, this range of emotions that we feel, the depths out of which we operate.
And then doing that kind of is this profound perspective giver, because here's a person who's, what struggle is his universe, and in going through that and being met by God, then all of a sudden here's this great, powerful sweep of, God in creation, and it's like, oh, there's all, all this and all that God is doing and all that God has done, and I love that. I think that's for me why I like big landscapes, why it's important to me to go, to a promontory and see the Ohio, or why vista points are important, because I need that that reminder of kind of the scope, because it is easy for us to kind of get in our little world and have all of that seem bigger than it is.
That is interesting. These proportions are enormous, aren't they? We're looking at.
I guess a question that comes to mind as we go toward the end of the chapter, there's this call to remembrance. Remember the greatness of God. Remember His deliverance, and of course the illustration is the deliverance in the Exodus through the waters. Do you think we may live in a generation that has no remembrance, and the stories that we heard and grew up with? Is that the norm anymore? Do people have a memory that can bring them back to an understanding of God? And if they don't, how do they get one? I guess that would be an interesting thought.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I once put up on the board two, sort of oval-looking things, like often are symbols of the tablets of the Ten Commandments. And I said to my youth group, I said, well, what do those make you think of immediately? And one said, the golden arches. That's McDonald's.
Yeah.
And it's a very different world that the kids get, and the stories they hear. I was intrigued again by a fellow who said, and I took him to heart, I think he's right, he said, if we don't tell these stories of the faith over and over and over again, we will leave our young generation to the stories that they get from Friends, or Sex in the City, or whatever other TV shows are popular at the time. Those stories, the stories that push us and we remember, and we really do instruct, don't they?
That's a good point. I know growing up, we went to church every time the doors were open. We went. No discussion. We went. And so as an adult, I go to church. Every time the doors are open, I go. However, I was divorced, and my children's mother was not raised that same way. Now my sons hardly ever go to church. I wonder how much is dependent upon that. I worry about that sometimes. And I just feel like the way we spend time with our children, with our loved ones, how much of that carries over? Well, I think the answer is obvious, very much. But I used to take them to McDonald's all the time, and now they take their kids to McDonald's, the Golden Arches again. So that continues.
it's a very important issue. I mean, it is it is what the secularity of the modern age is. These stories of the faith aren't shared. They're not in common with everybody.
Right.
You know, if 65% of the church, the community is unchurched, well, you can guess the children, maybe they have a few more children coming to church just by outreach, various outreaches, but still have 50% of the children not growing up with these stories in common.
But part of it too, I think, is that probably the church hasn't enough helped us experience those stories happening to us right now. That the Exodus story isn't just something that happened, you know, so many thousands of years ago, that it's not just about an event, but it is a dynamic at work in our lives. I did a little sermon series over the summer kind of looking at our congregation's journey in light of that Exodus story, and I know that because it seemed kind of obvious to me, and I know that that was something that was kind of hard for people to get their minds around. And as we walk through Lent, you know, that we're not just remembering what occurred, but we're remembering those dynamics at work, and that story happens again and again. And I think probably the church hasn't been helped really to see, to read our lives in light of those stories, because we are, you know, there's the remembering that we do with our minds, but there is the remembering that we do, that we are members of this body, that is, the body's experiencing it again, remembering.
Well, I think that's where the church has in many cases gotten caught up in the history of an event or the historical events in a way that they try to make that, you know, they crossed the Red Sea at this particular point, they camped here, they did that.
Right.
And we don't talk about the very thing that you've mentioned, and that is we're all on a journey, and we've all had periods of exodus where we left one thing to move toward another. And we're all going to go through Job's experiences, and we're all going to go through so much of what's in the Bible if we can simply retell it and help people to realize that they're here, they're in the Bible. Their life, our life, my life, we're here. It's how we're dealing with it that is the bigger issue.
Yeah.
It took me until I was 35 to really get that. I had an experience that felt like Good Friday, and then because sometimes I need things to be really obvious, I had an experience of resurrection on Easter, and I came back to my church the next week and was like, oh, you know, that it isn't just about Jesus, that happens for us too. And a fellow that loved me said, oh honey, that's going to happen lots of times in your life. And I, well, just once was enough. But I that was for me just a huge epiphany.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Let me just turn it one other way, and that is this has a lament feel to it. There is some genuine grief, sadness, sorrow that is in many of the Psalms. We don't lift that up quite as much as we do the praise Psalms, but the lament songs are really important. I had a teacher who reminded me over and over that the lament is where the new life really begins and takes shape. And when you know what you've lost, it's that sort of hard to understand notion, blessed are those who mourn in the Beatitudes, you know, that somehow it's in that grief, that lament that formulates our way ahead, that our faith really begins to distill and take shape. What do you think about that?
That makes perfect sense. Yes, that's when we really grow. It's not, as Reverend I mentioned, it's not in the good times. It's in the bad times when you're in there digging and you don't know if you're going to make it. That's when we grow.
Yeah, we seem to sort of try to avoid that grief, that sadness, that sorrow. Sometimes we even bypass
We
it.
medicate it.
Yeah, or we
we
medicate
try
it.
to
That's
solve it.
exactly right, in all
Certainly do.
kinds of ways. But I think here is another encouragement to embrace it and to see what it has to offer, what really it is trying to push our lives into, form our lives into. Yeah.
I think that's an important challenge. But I do think that, one of the reasons that we don't do that is not because we lack faith, but because we're afraid that whatever we're experiencing will only get worse. And I think that's just too painful a place.
We don't like pain.
Yeah.
I know.
I can remember a friend telling me that their church didn't have Maundy, Thursday, or Good Friday services because they were afraid it'd be too much of a downer for people to go through. And it's this psalm corrects us on that kind of thing, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Well,
This is a fantastic chapter. I can't remember really looking at it like this before, but it's really powerful.
It is a good.
It's meaty. It's good stuff.
well, that's kind of one of the gifts of drawing on the Psalms that are listed in Eugene Peterson's book, is it does kind of invite us to look at ones that we wouldn't be, looking at. We go, we kind of go to our favorites, and those are good, but it's kind of like ordering something off the menu that you haven't had before, and you find out, ooh, that's delicious. That's delicious.
We thank you all for being here, helping us unfold the riches, the unsearchable riches of the Word again. Rick Dye, Phil Justice, glad not only for your presence here, but your good work throughout this community. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And we're glad you all have been with us. Hope you'll continue to follow us here on Reflections. If you want to see this show repeated or other shows, you can go to Paducah, 2.org on the internet and find us there as well.
Do join us again and join Paducah Cooperative Ministry in doing what they do so well, what we're all called to do, which is do God's work with human hands. Thanks for joining us. Shalom.
Shalom.
In mission together.